Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said when Katie Rodriguez's application crossed his desk. Just a nurse with community college credits and 2 years at some rural clinic. He didn't see the way her hands moved when she placed a central line, precise as a laser, steady as someone who'd done this in desert camps with mortar fire rattling the windows. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, so all the stitching was coming undone. He didn't see that Katie Rodriguez was the kind of quiet that comes from having already survived the worst. What happened next would change everything about how he measured his own power. The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial hummed their constant mechanical meditation. 6:38 a.m. Monday. The cardiac unit stretched out in pale greens and whites, monitors blinking their steady digital heartbeat, the air thick with antiseptic and something else, the particular smell of a place where people learned whether they'd live or die before breakfast. Katie Rodriguez moved through the hallway with deliberate invisibility, straightening patient sheets with hands that bore faint scars across the knuckles, reading charts with an intensity that made the other nurses think she was nervous rather than thorough. 32 days. She'd been at Oak Creek for exactly 32 days without drawing attention, without mentioning the 3 tours she'd served, without so much as a shadow of the woman she used to be appearing in a break room or parking lot. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read Ard Rodriguez, RN, and nothing else. No credentials listed. No initials. Just a name thin enough to disappear into background noise. The scrubs were navy blue like everyone else's, sensible shoes, hair tied back so it wouldn't interfere with patient care. She'd learned long ago how to make herself invisible, not the invisibility of fear, but the invisibility of perfect competence. Nobody notices the nurse who doesn't make mistakes. Nobody asks questions about the woman who gets the job done and goes home. But the scar tissue on her hands told stories. So did the way she moved through doorways, always clearing the frame first, always checking angles, muscle memory from Baghdad that she couldn't turn off even when she wanted to. She'd tried. For 18 months after the classified operation went sideways and the military erased her from existence, she'd tried to be the kind of person who could sit on a couch and watch television without calculating exit routes. The scars won. The muscle memory won. So she came to Savannah and became someone nobody needed to know about. The post-op bleed started at 7:23 a.m. The monitor alarm didn't shriek. It didn't need to. Katie heard the subtle shift in tone from the bed in Bay 4 and was moving before the attending even looked up from his coffee. The patient was 12 hours out from a coronary artery bypass, a 68-year-old accountant named Gerald Walsh who'd been joking about seeing his grandkids graduate high school, and now his chest dressing was blooming red like a flower opening in time-lapse. "We've got active bleeding, pressure dressing failing," Katie said. Not a request. Not uncertain. Just information. Her voice had dropped half an octave already, that shift that happened when the work began. "I'm going to need a suture tray, for .0 silk, and someone to hold pressure." The resident froze. The nurse practitioner hesitated. Neither one was equipped for what was happening in that moment, and Katie knew it the way you know when someone's about to panic, the slight widening of the eyes, the breath that comes too fast. So she did what she'd learned to do in places where panicking meant people died. She took over. Sterile field. Now. She was already scrubbing her hands, the soap smelling like hospitals everywhere, same chemical bite, same visceral familiarity. Her hands moved without thinking, muscle memory and precision colliding into something that looked almost casual. The gloves snapped on with that sharp sound that always reminded her of pistol hammers back in Baghdad, that sharp pop that meant work was beginning. The scar tissue across her knuckles caught the light as she reached for the suture needle. The bleeding was arterial. Venous. Capillary. 3 different sources all weeping blood into the surgical site, and the cross-stitch suture technique she employed wasn't in any textbook they taught at community colleges. It was something else entirely, something learned in a forward operating base in the Jolan district where you didn't have time for traditional methodology and your patient was a fellow operator who wouldn't make it if you hesitated. The needle went in. The knot pulled. The thread caught. 40 seconds later, the bleeding stopped like someone had turned off a faucet. Sinus rhythm remained stable. O2 sat climbing steadily. The accountant from Savannah was going to live because a woman named Katie Rodriguez knew how to sew skin together in a way that shouldn't have worked but did. She stepped back. Stripped her gloves. The room was completely silent except for the ventilator wheeze and the monitor's steady digital pulse. 3 seconds of quiet. Then someone, the resident, probably, exhaled. But Dr. Sterling was standing in the doorway. He'd been there the whole time, watching. Watching the technique. Watching the hands. Watching the way she moved with absolute certainty through a crisis that should have ended with a code blue call and a family getting bad news. He waited until she was stepping out of the isolation precautions, then approached her in the hallway like a man who'd just seen something that contradicted his entire understanding of how the world worked. 58 years old. Tailored suit under his white coat. The kind of doctor who listed his degrees on his office wall and kept a photo of his sailboat on his desk. The kind of doctor who believed that power came from institutions and credentials and knowing the right people at Emory and Johns Hopkins. Interesting technique, Rodriguez. Where exactly did you train? His voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, but his eyes had gone sharp. He was already calculating. Already wondering what he'd missed. Katie didn't meet his gaze. That was part of the invisibility. She'd learned to answer questions while looking at her hands, her shoes, anything but the person asking. Part of staying small. Part of not drawing attention. Community college nursing program, then that rural clinic I mentioned in my application. Her voice was soft. Careful. Exactly what you'd expect from someone with that resume. I learned suturing from observation mostly. Lots of high-acuity patients at the clinic. You pick things up. It was a lie, but it was a good lie. The kind of lie that worked because it was almost true. She had done those things. She just hadn't done only those things. She'd also done 17 emergency procedures in a combat hospital, been trained by a surgical team that included a retired Navy trauma surgeon, and spent 18 years learning how to keep people alive when the standard textbook responses weren't available. But Dr. Sterling didn't need to know any of that. She'd come to Savannah to disappear, and disappearing required staying quiet about who you used to be. What that meant was that Katie Rodriguez needed to be invisible. No recognition. No questions. No one looking too closely at the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, so faded now that the stitching was coming undone, but she kept it there anyway. The symbol of a life that the military had erased from all official records. The evidence of 3 tours. The proof that she was someone who'd been trusted with classified operations until one went sideways and the Pentagon decided that Katie Rodriguez had never existed at all. She'd chosen this hospital because it was large enough to disappear in, prestigious enough that people minded their business, and far enough from anywhere she used to be that old ghost stayed buried. 32 days of keeping her head down, straightening sheets, checking vitals, doing the invisible work that kept patients alive while doctors got the credit. 32 days of being just a nurse. But she wasn't invisible to Dr. Sterling anymore. That was the problem. By 8:15 a.m., Katie was reviewing discharge summaries in the nurse's station, her eyes moving through charts with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. The work was routine, post-operative documentation, medication reconciliation, the endless paper trail that kept modern medicine functioning. But something caught her attention during the cardiac unit's billing records. A phantom code. Then another. Then 6 more scattered across 18 months of patient care. The codes were subtle. Sophisticated. The kind of billing entries that only someone with intimate knowledge of the cardiac unit systems could slip through without triggering automated reviews. 18 months of code runs through the same attending, Dr. Sterling himself. Charges for procedures that never happened, medications never dispensed, equipment that never touched a patient. Not a fortune, but enough. 50,000 in a month. 120,000 spread across the year. The kind of money that could fund a second property, a boat upgrade, or whatever else a cardiologist decided he deserved beyond his already substantial salary. Katie closed the chart. Didn't mark anything. Didn't tell anyone. She'd learned long ago that seeing things you weren't supposed to see came with certain responsibilities, and chief among them was knowing when to keep your mouth shut and observe the larger situation. In Baghdad, you didn't report what you knew until you understood the full scope of what was happening. Same principle applied in a hospital in Savannah, just with different stakes. But knowing something and being able to unknow it were two different things. Now she was carrying information that Dr. Sterling didn't know she had, and that information was a problem. Not for Katie. Not yet. But problems had a way of revealing themselves when you least expected them. The morning huddle happened at 9:13 a.m. The cardiac unit gathered in the break room with their coffee getting cold while the charge nurse reviewed admissions and discharges. Katie stood in the back like always, present but not present, the kind of person who took up less space than her actual body occupied. She was thinking about what she'd seen in those billing codes when Dr. Sterling walked in with a red dry erase marker in his hand and something in his expression that made the room's temperature drop. He walked directly to the unit board. Wrote in letters large enough for everyone to read from across the room, "Unauthorized procedures, Rodriguez, final warning." The room went dead silent. Katie didn't move. Didn't respond. Her composure was absolute, not the composure of fear or shame, but the composure of someone who'd survived worse than a red marker insult on a public board. The composure of someone who understood that this moment was the opening move in something larger and more strategic than simple cruelty. This was calculated. This was public. This was a man establishing dominance before anything else happened. Before Katie could speak, before anyone else could react, he turned to face the gathered staff with the bearing of someone completely certain of his authority in this space. "I'm concerned about some of the procedures being performed on this unit without proper oversight," he said. His voice was smooth again, perfectly reasonable, the kind of tone that made his accusation sound not like accusations but like a doctor simply concerned about patient safety. "We follow protocols for a reason. When someone decides to improvise, it puts patients at risk. I trust everyone understands the importance of staying within scope of practice." His eyes found Katie's across the room for exactly 1 second. Then he was gone, walking back out the door with the same confidence he'd walked in with, leaving the red letters hanging on the board like blood on a white wall. The other nurses looked at Katie. She looked at her shoes. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. And in that moment of silence, something shifted in the cardiac unit at Oak Creek Memorial, not because Katie Rodriguez had done anything wrong, but because someone who wielded institutional power had decided that she was a problem that needed managing. The question wasn't whether he'd find out about the billing codes. The question was what he would do first to neutralize her before she became a threat he couldn't control. The red marker on the unit board caught the morning light like a stop sign. Katie read her own name in Sterling's precise handwriting, "Unauthorized procedures, Rodriguez, final warning." The letters were thick and deliberate, meant to be seen from across the room during morning huddle. Sarah from orthopedics spotted it first. Then markers from pharmacy. By the time Katie arrived for her shift, 5 nurses had already circled the announcement like wolves testing a perimeter. None of them looked at her directly. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual. She clocked in at 6:45 a.m. and started her rounds without comment. Professional. Invisible. The way she'd learned to survive. 2 days later, Sterling made his move. Mrs. Chen lay in bed 3 of the cardiac unit, 3 days post-sternotomy, her chest incision healing beneath Montgomery straps that Katie had applied with surgical precision. The adhesive allergy was documented in 3 places: the chart, the allergy band on the patient's wrist, the care board at the nursing station. Katie approached the dressing change methodically, saline, sterile gauze, fresh straps positioned at 45-degree angles to distribute tension evenly and prevent skin breakdown. Mrs. Chen's daughter and son-in-law sat in the corner chairs, watching every movement. The door opened. Dr. Sterling entered with the weight of someone who'd learned that authority lived in how you occupied a room. "Tell me, Rodriguez," he said, his voice edged with something that pretended to be curiosity but tasted like vinegar, "or should I call you Nurse Fumbles, can you explain why you're using Montgomery straps instead of standard adhesive?" Katie's hands didn't pause. the second strap secured with a soft click of the fastener. Her voice came out level, clinical. The patient has documented adhesive allergy, doctor. It's in her chart. Perhaps if you spent less time improvising and more time following protocols, you wouldn't need to make excuses. Sterling smiled the way a predator smiles before testing whether prey will run. Mrs. Chen's daughter shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the public nature of the correction. The son-in-law pretended to study his phone. Katie finished the dressing change. Her movements were flawless: hand position, dressing alignment, securing the tape without tension. Textbook. Untouchable. The kind of technique that came from muscle memory, from years of field medicine where a sloppy dressing change meant infection, sepsis, death. She felt the words landing like small stones in still water, each one creating ripples she refused to acknowledge. When she straightened, a single tear escaped her left eye. She caught it immediately, wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could fall, and met Sterling's gaze directly. Her eyes were dry before he could blink. Steel grey. Unbroken. "I've survived worse than you, doctor," she said quietly. The silence that followed had texture, thick, almost physical. Mrs. Chen's daughter stopped pretending to look away. Sterling's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath his skin like something trying to escape. He turned and left without another word, but Katie felt the shift in the room's pressure. She'd drawn a line he didn't know existed. Now he would spend every waking moment trying to erase it. The break room was her sanctuary and her tomb. Katie sat at the small table near the window, unwrapping a sandwich she'd brought from home, turkey and mustard on wheat, nothing fancy, something she could eat alone. Sarah from orthopedics was there, standing by the coffee machine with a styrofoam cup half raised to her lips. When Sarah saw Katie settle into a chair, she set the cup down carefully on the counter, grabbed her phone, and walked out without making eye contact. The door swung shut behind her. 2 minutes later, Marcus from pharmacy did the same thing. He had a full lunch tray, leftover pad thai that smelled rich and ginger-forward, but he abandoned it on the microwave when Katie sat down. He didn't run. He simply gathered his things and left with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that association carried cost. By the time Katie opened her sandwich, 3 others had filtered out, leaving half-eaten lunches and the bitter smell of abandoned coffee. She ate slowly, watching the clock. 12:37. Shift had started 90 minutes ago. 90 minutes of invisibility so complete it had become a form of violence. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed, a high, persistent frequency that made her teeth ache. She'd been hearing it for years, in different hospitals, different countries. The sound of institutional fluorescence was the same everywhere. Sterile. Permanent. Indifferent. She finished her sandwich and left the break room cleaner than she'd found it. Friday afternoon, Sterling's office was exactly what Katie expected: mahogany desk, leather chair, a framed photograph of him with 2 board members at some charity event. The air smelled like expensive cologne and the recycled cold of aggressive air conditioning. Sterling sat behind the desk with his fingers steepled, a classic power pose that made him look like someone who'd learned negotiation from a TED Talk. "You're creating liability concerns," he said without preamble. "One more incident and I'll have grounds for termination. The hospital takes protocol violations seriously." Katie stood, "Not Saturday." Standing gave her an advantage, kept her center of gravity mobile, kept her hands accessible if she needed them. Her military training was so deep in her muscle memory it operated without permission. "I understand, doctor." "Do you?" His eyes were narrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone with a dangerous level of confidence in her own judgment." Katie took one measured breath. Her voice came out exactly as it needed to, calm, professional, with the kind of composure that only comes from having already seen the worst the world could offer. "I've survived worse than you, doctor." Sterling's face darkened. The words hung in the air like smoke. He opened his mouth to respond, but Katie was already turning toward the door. She moved with a kind of fluid grace that comes from years of controlled violence, from understanding your own power so completely that you never need to demonstrate it. The door closed behind her before he could form another sentence. Bed 7 in the cardiac unit held Daniel Carver, 52 years old, Army combat medic with a surgical scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline. Triple bypass scheduled for Monday. Katie entered his room Friday evening during the pre-surgical assessment, checking the foresight, confirming the medication labels, noting the slight pleural effusion that would need draining before they could take him to the OR. She positioned him carefully, left side, hip slightly elevated, landmarks identified through palpation. The 14th rib was visible beneath his ribs as a subtle ridge. She marked the site with the edge of her thumb, feeling bone and cartilage and the precise architecture of the human skeleton. Antiseptic solution cooled the skin. The needle went in at the 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line, the angle exactly 90 degrees to the chest wall. A 14-gauge angiocath needle, smooth as silk. The resistance released when it breached the pleura. She guided the tube, flexible, resilient, alive in her hands, and secured it to his chest wall with a dressing that would hold for 48 hours. 90 seconds. From position to completion. Daniel Carver watched every movement. The morphine was supposed to make him drift, but his eyes were sharp. They tracked her hands like he was reading a language most people couldn't speak. When Katie secured the final tape, he caught her wrist gently but with unmistakable precision. "You move like 18th Airborne," he said. Katie's face went blank. The kind of blank that comes from a switch being thrown somewhere deep in her nervous system. "You're mistaken, sir. Rest now. I've worked with enough medics." Carver's voice was rough, worn smooth by 3 decades of field hospitals and combat zones. "To know when I'm looking at someone who's been where the work matters." Katie pulled her wrist free with the gentleness of someone removing a hand from a child. "You need sleep, Mr. Carver. Dr. Sterling wants you rested for pre-op." She left the room before he could speak again. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. But somewhere in her chest, a door she'd sealed shut 8 months ago rattled against its hinges. Through the glass partition, Dr. Sterling had been watching the entire exchange. He'd seen the patient grab her. He'd seen the moment her composure cracked, just half a second, barely perceptible, but it was there. A fracture in the facade. He made a mental note, then made a phone call that evening to Patricia Hargrove, board member, wife of the man Sterling's surgical referral had saved 2 years ago. Debts had value. Loyalty had currency. "I need you to look into someone's credentials," he said into the phone, watching the parking lot from his office window, watching Katie leave the hospital at 7:15 p.m. with her shoulders squared against the rain that had started falling like small stones against the glass. The code alarm screamed at 2:36 a.m. like a siren warning of something worse than death. Katie was restocking the med room on the cardiac unit when the sound split through the fluorescent hum, not the routine alert that meant someone's monitor had slipped, but the full orchestral panic of a patient crashing. Bed 7. She knew before the intercom crackled with the announcement. She'd been watching Daniel Carver all night, the grizzled combat medic from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines who'd been admitted 46 hours earlier with a traumatic pericardial effusion. His chest X-ray had shown the fluid collection building like a threat, millimeter by millimeter, but radiology said it could wait until morning. Waiting was a luxury that meant something had changed. Katie moved before thinking, her body remembering protocols her mind had buried 3 years ago. The elevator would take 30 seconds she didn't have. Stairs. 2 flights down, shoulders driving through the stairwell door like a charge, boots hitting linoleum with the precise percussion of someone who'd run into combat zones in the dark and learned to move without announcing herself. The cardiac unit hallway was already chaos, a nurse shouting vitals, another fumbling with an 4 cart, the resident on call frozen at the bedside with an ultrasound probe hanging from his hand like a useless thing. Daniel Carver lay ashen on the stretcher, his skin the color of old newspaper. His neck veins distended like cords, his breathing shallow and fast, his blood pressure crashing, 60/40, the monitor showing the numbers dropping with each passing second. Beck's triad. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac around his heart had filled with blood from the traumatic injury, and now his heart couldn't pump. He had maybe 4 minutes before his organ started dying. "I need to call the attending," Dr. Patel said, his voice thin and breaking. 26 years old, 6 months out of medical school, his hands trembling as he held the ultrasound probe over Carver's chest. He'd been trained for this in theory. Theory and reality split apart in moments like these. Katie didn't answer. She moved to the bedside, her hands already reaching for the sterile tray someone had the good sense to leave there. Betadine. Spinal needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac. A 10 cubic centimeters syringe. The equipment felt like an old language she was suddenly remembering, each piece a word in a sentence her body knew how to speak. "Step back," she said, and Dr. Patel stepped back without questioning. The tone had changed. The voice that had said "my apologies, Doctor" who in Sterling's office had dropped an octave into something that sounded like authority. Like someone who'd given orders in sandstorms and had them obeyed. Katie prepped Carver's chest with betadine, the orange antiseptic spreading across his sternum like a map she'd already memorized. Her fingers found the landmarks without searching, the xiphoid process, the junction where rib met cartilage, the exact anatomy that meant survival or death. Muscle memory. Her hands moved on their own, the small movements precise and economical, nothing wasted. No tremor. No hesitation. The spinal needle came up in her right hand, 25 millimeters of steel that needed to enter at exactly 45 degrees, needed to puncture the fibrous pericardial sac without tearing the heart wall beneath it. The margin for error was approximately the thickness of a fingernail. She inserted it into the space below the xiphoid process, angling upward and to the left, her fingers tracking the needle's path through tissue the way a musician's hands track a violin. Carver's blood pressure was 58/38 now. The monitor beat with the frantic rhythm of a heart being strangled. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. The syringe attached to the needle filled with blood, dark, venous blood, the color of rust. She drew back on the plunger. 30 ccs. 60 ccs. The blood flowed like water opening in reverse. 100 ccs. 120. The needle had found the accumulated pool of blood that had been suffocating Daniel Carver's heart, and with each cc she removed, his body got closer to the border between death and living. His blood pressure climbed. 70/45. 85/55. 90/62. Color returned to his face like someone turning up a dimmer switch. The ashen gray faded to something almost human. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. The code team exploded through the doors 8 seconds after she withdrew the needle, the ICU nurses with their equipment cart, the attending cardiologist, a respiratory tech pushing a ventilator. They arrived to find a patient whose vitals were stable, whose oxygen saturation was climbing, whose heart was beating with purpose again instead of suffocating against the pressure in his chest. Dr. Patel stared at Katie as though she'd become something other than the quiet nurse who'd been assigned to his unit. His mouth opened and closed. He didn't have words. Daniel Carver's eyes opened. Clear. Focused. His gaze locked onto Katie's face with the sudden intensity of someone who'd just survived something that was supposed to kill him, and in that moment of absolute clarity, his eyes widened as recognition struck him like a physical thing. His lips moved. His voice came out as a whisper, rough and disbelieving. Viper. The word hung in the air of the ICU bay like an alarm bell that only certain people could hear. Katie's hand, the hand that had just performed a pericardiocentesis in 90 seconds with the steady precision of someone who'd done emergency medical procedures in places where there were no second chances, trembled for the first time in 3 years. Just a half second. A flutter. The kind of involuntary response that comes when the past reaches through time and grabs you by the throat. She withdrew her hand from the bedside. Looked away from Carver. Moved back into the controlled pattern of a regular nurse checking the 4 line, making sure nothing had been dislodged during the code, performing the small invisible tasks that hospitals demanded so that people like her could disappear into the system. Dr. Patel was already on his phone, his voice climbing with excitement as he described what he'd witnessed to someone on the other end. The attending cardiologist was reviewing the ultrasound, his face carrying that expression doctors got when they realized they'd arrived at a code that had already been sold by someone else. The nurses were already breaking down the crash cart, returning equipment to its slots, the ballet of ICU operations resuming its rhythm. But Dr. Sterling had been called in for the code. It was his patient, his unit, his authority that was supposed to have been consulted before an emergency pericardiocentesis. He stood in the doorway of bed 7 with his arms crossed, his eyes moving from the patient to the monitor to Katie, and his jaw tightened in a way that communicated something far more dangerous than anger. It communicated calculation. He'd seen what Katie had done. More importantly, he'd heard what Daniel Carver had called her. Not thank you. Not brilliant. Not whoever you are. Viper. A call sign. A name that meant something. A name that connected Katie to a world that Sterling had just realized she'd been hiding from him. He stepped back into the hallway, his phone already in his hand, his thumb moving across the screen with the precise aggression of someone making plans that would not include asking politely for cooperation. Katie didn't watch him leave. She stayed with Daniel Carver, checking his vitals, confirming the 4 placement, performing the work of a nurse who had just saved a life and was now making sure that life stayed saved. Her voice remained low, her hand steady, every movement deliberate and controlled. The tremor was gone. The mask was back in place, held there with the same discipline that had kept her alive through 3 tours in Baghdad and whatever classified operation had ended with her erased from existence. But the word Daniel had spoken, Viper, was already spreading like a current through the hospital. Dr. Patel was still talking to someone on the phone, still describing what he'd seen in a voice filled with the wonder of someone who'd witnessed something extraordinary and didn't yet understand that extraordinary could also be dangerous. The nurses in the unit were exchanging glances, the kind of looks that came when a mystery suddenly had depth, when an invisible person was suddenly visible, when the quiet nurse who'd never mentioned her past had just revealed something in 90 seconds that changed how everyone would look at her from this moment forward. By 3:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling had already called Joel Thompson, a board member who'd received a very favorable mortgage renewal because of Sterling's intervention with a banker friend. By 3:56 a.m., he'd texted his attorney with the subject line, Credential Verification Inquiry. By 4:22 a.m., he was on a call with a consultant from an outside firm that specialized in verifying professional credentials and investigating patterns of boundary violations in hospital staff. The consultant had never met Katie Rodriguez. The consultant had no knowledge of whether she'd actually violated any boundaries. But the consultant understood that his job was not to find truth, his job was to find ammunition. Katie finished her shift at 7:19 a.m., clocking out in the time-worn system that had been tracking her hours since her first day, and she walked to her car in the parking lot without speaking to anyone. The rain that had fallen during her shift had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and gleaming like a mirror. She sat in her vehicle for exactly 4 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel, before she started the engine and drove toward the address she'd memorized months ago but had never visited during daylight. The rain started again as she pulled away from Oak Creek Memorial, light and cold against the windshield. Katie didn't turn on the wipers. She let them fall, accumulating, blurring her view of the road ahead until the world became abstract and unclear, until there was nothing to see but the suggestion of what might be waiting. The wipers stayed off. Rain accumulated on the windshield, turning the Savannah streets into watercolor abstractions. Katie's hands gripped the steering wheel at 10:02, the way she'd been trained 15 years ago. The way muscle memory never forgot. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Text from an unknown number, "This is Helen Parks, Oak Creek Memorial HR. Please come to my office Monday 9 a.m. Mandatory." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. The weekend stretched like a held breath. Saturday morning, Sterling made his first call to board member Thomas Whitmore, who owed him favors from a golf tournament investment that had quietly vanished. "I have concerns about one of our nursing staff," Sterling said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "Credential discrepancies. Possibly forged references. We're looking at liability exposure, Tom." By noon, Whitmore had called the hospital administrator. By evening, the second board member, Judith Chen, received a similar call with different angles but identical conclusions. Sterling didn't stop there. Monday morning, before Katie's 9 o'clock appointment, he contacted 3 of her listed references from her resume. To a retired Navy captain, he mentioned credential fraud investigations. To a trauma surgeon in San Diego, he planted doubt, "We're just trying to verify her background, but we're finding some inconsistencies." To her former nursing supervisor at Naval Medical Center San Diego, he was more direct, "We have reason to believe her credentials may have been misrepresented. Can you confirm her actual experience level?" Each conversation was calibrated, deniable, legally clean. Each one left the reference uncertain enough to hedge their endorsement. Then he brought in Dr. Marcus Feldman, an outside consultant from Atlanta General who specialized in compliance and pattern analysis. Feldman had never met Katie. Feldman knew nothing about her except what Sterling had told him. Sterling had framed it carefully, overstepping boundaries. Taking charge of codes that weren't hers to manage. Suggesting procedures outside her scope. A pattern of insubordination masked as clinical excellence. Feldman's job was to document this into an official report. Feldman's fee was $8,000, non-refundable. By Monday at 8:38 a.m., the infrastructure was in place. The allegations didn't need to be true. They just needed to create enough friction that the hospital's legal team would insist on suspension pending investigation. Which meant deactivating her badge. Which meant removing her from the building. Which meant severing her last thread. Katie sat in Helen Park's office at exactly 9 a.m. Parks was a bureaucrat with kind eyes and the exhausted posture of someone who had made a career out of delivering bad news. She didn't make eye contact. She had a script on her desk, printed in Arial 11-point, 3 paragraphs of institutional language. "Katie, I want you to know this isn't personal," Parks began, which was how everyone started conversations that were entirely personal in their consequences. "We've received multiple concerns regarding your credentials and your clinical practice patterns. Dr. Sterling has raised flags about several incidents." Parks adjusted her glasses. "We've contracted an independent consultant to review these concerns. Until that review is complete, your employment is suspended effective immediately." Katie's hands lay flat on her thighs. Her breathing was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the careful, measured restraint of someone who had learned in Baghdad that showing your damage was how enemies found your weaknesses. "The specific allegations?" Katie's voice was level as a surgical plane. "I'm not at liberty to detail them yet. This is a fact-finding investigation. You'll be notified if we need additional information from you." Parks slid an envelope across the desk. "Your suspension letter. Your badge will be deactivated at 3:15 p.m. Security will escort you from the building." 3:15 p.m. They had chosen an exact time, which meant they had choreographed this. Which meant they didn't want witnesses beyond the necessary few. Which meant Sterling had planned for her to walk past the afternoon staff, past the cardiac unit where Daniel Carver was still recovering, past every nurse who had watched her, judged her, and ultimately rejected her. "Am I being fired?" Katie asked. "You're being suspended pending investigation. There's a distinction. This is protective for everyone." Parks' eyes finally met hers, and Katie saw the genuine regret there. Parks was not the enemy. Parks was just the mechanism. "I'm sorry, Katie. I don't know the details well enough to comment further." Katie stood. "I understand." She had learned in briefing rooms and in the field that the moment you lost an operation, you accepted the loss cleanly. You didn't argue. You didn't appeal. You extracted yourself and regrouped. You were already thinking about the next move while the present one was still collapsing. She left Park's office at 9:23 a.m. By 3:15 p.m., 2 security guards stood at her locker in the staff room, one named Derek, who had always nodded at her, and another she didn't recognize. Derek wouldn't make eye contact now. Neither of them spoke as Katie emptied the contents of her locker into a small cardboard box. Coffee mug from Naval Medical Center San Diego. A spare badge holder. A paperback she'd been reading. Her jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, hidden the way it was meant to be hidden. She wore her composure like body armor. The walk to the security desk took her past the cardiac unit. Sarah from orthopedics looked at her shoes. Marcus from the med dispensary turned toward the med cabinet. Jennifer, the nurse who had become something close to friendly, stared at her computer screen with the intensity of someone reading top-secret documents. The break room door was closed. Of course it was. Katie was radioactive now. Katie was the thing they had been waiting to explode. Derek scanned her badge at the security terminal. The light went red. "Deactivated," he said quietly. Not unkindly. Just stating a fact. Katie carried the box through the main entrance. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause from an audience that didn't exist. She sat in her car for 7 minutes without moving, hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, before she drove north to Bonaventure Cemetery. The headstone was granite, weathered by salt air and 13 years of Savannah humidity. The inscription was spare, CPO Michael Rodriguez, U.S. Navy, Baghdad 2019. Below that, nothing else. No poetry. No eulogy. Just his name, his rank, his location, his year. Katie knelt in the rain. The water ran off her shoulders and soaked through her scrubs. She had worn the same scrubs to work that morning, thinking it would be a normal shift. Thinking she had survived another month. Thinking the worst was behind her. "I promised you I'd find a way to keep helping people, Mike." Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "I couldn't even last 2 months." She pressed her forehead against the cold stone. 14 years of marriage. 3 tours together, 2 in Kandahar, 1 in Helmand Province where they had met at Forward Operating Base Shank. Mike had been Delta Force. She had been Naval Special Warfare. They had found each other in a war zone because that was the only place either of them had felt like they made sense. He had come home from the classified operation in Baghdad with a wound that never healed. Not physically. He had lasted 6 months in Tampa before the insomnia and the nightmares turned into something worse. She had found him in the garage on a Tuesday morning in 2019. The Pentagon had erased her immediately after, put her in witness protection, given her a new social security number and a job as a civilian nurse, sent her to Savannah with the instruction to never speak of her service again. "They erased me once," she whispered to the stone. "Now they've done it again." Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery. Katie stayed until the light went industrial gray and the rain softened to something quieter. Then she drove to her apartment, a furnished 1-bedroom in Midtown that could have belonged to anyone, which was precisely the point. She sat on the couch without turning on the lights. On the side table was their wedding photo. Both of them in dress uniforms. Both of them 19 years younger. Both of them still whole. She stared at that photograph for 4 hours without moving. 3 nights later, at 11:22 p.m., Katie entered Oak Creek Memorial through the loading dock using the security code she had memorized during her first week. The code hadn't been changed. Of course it hadn't. No one thought the suspended nurse would come back. No one thought the erased nurse had anything left to lose. She was walking down the 4th-floor hallway toward the staff lockers when the shouting started. A man's voice, enormous and raw and furious. "Where is he? Where's the witness?" Katie's body responded before her conscious mind caught up. She was moving toward the sound, not away from it. Her hands were already positioned. Her breathing was already controlled. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, and the woman wearing that jacket was someone Katie Rodriguez had erased 3 years ago. The woman moving toward the cardiac unit was someone else entirely. The hallway was empty when the man forced his way through the cardiac unit service entrance. 7 feet tall, maybe 400 pounds, with the kind of raw violence in his posture that comes from zero fear and maximum rage. He waved a pistol like it was an extension of his hand and screamed for someone, a name, an address, a witness, his voice echoing off the tile like a threat made of thunder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. The nurses scattered. Some ran toward the administrative wing. Others froze behind nursing stations, phones trembling in their hands. One called 911. Another locked herself in a supply closet. Katie was closing the latch on her locker when she heard the first scream. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call for backup. The woman in the faded jacket with the unit patch sewn inside its lining didn't think like a nurse anymore. She thought like a senior chief petty officer who'd spent 13 years recognizing threats the way most people recognized colors. She moved into the hallway. The gunman turned toward her. His eyes were chemical, dilated pupils, the wild focus of someone riding methamphetamine and adrenaline like a wave. He raised the pistol toward her center mass. "Where's the witness? Where's the—" Katie didn't wait for him to finish. She closed the distance in 2 steps, moving with the kind of fluid grace that comes from 1,000 hours of hand-to-hand drilling in the dust outside Baghdad. Her right hand crossed his wrist, the gun arm, and redirected the barrel upward. The shot fired. Plaster exploded from the ceiling tile above them. The sound was percussion, absolute. Her left hand came up and drove the heel of her palm toward his face, but she didn't follow through. She pivoted instead, using his own momentum, his size against him like water moves around stone. His feet came up. His body came down. The back of his head hit the tile, and the air left his lungs in a wheeze that sounded almost human. For seconds. The entire sequence from hallway standing to prone submission took for seconds. Katie stepped over him, her breathing unchanged, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Stay down." She pressed his wrist, the gun arm, into a hyperextended position that screamed pain without causing permanent damage. Physics, not violence. Leverage, not cruelty. The pistol lay 2 feet away, spinning slowly across the tile. She didn't need it. She kept pressure on his wrist until she heard the first radio transmission from security. The man howled. She didn't flinch. Daniel Carver stood in the doorway of his hospital room, still tethered to the cardiac monitor by a trailing cable of leads. His oxygen saturation was 96%. His heart rate was elevated but stable. His eyes had gone wide, the kind of wide that comes from recognizing something you thought was dead. The kind of recognition that comes from watching your call sign materialize in front of you in scrubs and a hospital ID. He limped forward, his surgical boot scraping against the tile, and he didn't stop until the uniformed security officers arrived with their hands on their duty belts and confusion written across their faces. One officer secured the gunman's hands with zip ties. Another called for an ambulance. A third raised his radio to call the police department. But Daniel moved past all of them. He approached Helen Parks, who had emerged from her office with her hand over her mouth, her face the color of chalk. Daniel leaned close. His voice was a whisper that carried the weight of recognition, of memory, of survival itself. One word. Just one. Viper. Helen Parks' eyes snapped toward Katie. The 2 women locked onto each other across 20 feet of hallway. Helen's face shifted. Something crystallized in her expression, understanding, shock, the realization that the woman she'd suspended 3 hours ago, the woman she'd escorted out with a security guard at her elbow, was responsible for the fact that Daniel Carver was standing upright instead of lying in a body bag. That Katie hadn't just survived the gunman. She dismantled him like he was nothing. Like she'd done this before. Which she had. Dr. Sterling watched the scene from his office window, located at the far end of the cardiac wing. He saw the gunman go down. He saw the security officers move in. He saw Helen Parks' face change. And in that moment, with the clarity that only comes to people watching their world collapse, he understood that the game was over. The nurse wasn't suspended. The nurse was a weapon. And weapons don't stay contained in administrative files. He locked his office door. His hands shook as he navigated to the hospital server through his computer terminal. Username. Password. Access granted. He moved through the directories with the kind of desperate precision that comes from muscle memory combined with absolute panic. He found the security footage archives. He found the cardiac unit billing records from the past 18 months. Phantom codes. Procedures that never happened. Phantom patients that never existed. Meridian Medical Supply kickbacks totaling $340,000 spread across hidden accounts that bore his name in a subsection of the hospital's finance system that few people even knew existed. He selected the entire folder and moved toward the delete function. He clicked. The progress bar filled. 10%. 30%. But in the IT department, 3 floors below, Jason Torres watched the same deletion on a secondary monitor that mirrored all administrative access. Torres was a Marine Corps veteran who'd done 2 tours in Helmand Province, and he understood protocol the way normal people understood breathing. He'd been tracking Sterling's access patterns for 6 weeks. Not because he suspected fraud. Because something in the billing records had triggered an automated flag, and Torres had done exactly what the manual said to do. He'd watched. Now he watched Sterling try to erase 18 months of evidence. Torres recorded every frame. He copied the entire billing database to an encrypted drive. He burned a secondary copy to a physical CD. Then he stood up, walked out of his cubicle, and moved through the hospital corridors toward Helen Park's office with a thick manila folder in his hands. Inside that folder were printed screenshots. Dates. Procedure codes that didn't match any patient in the system. Billing amounts ranging from $4,000 to $18,000 per phantom procedure. Each page was time-stamped. Each page was evidence. He knocked on Helen Park's door. When she opened it, she was still processing the gunman, still absorbing the fact that her suspended nurse had just executed a tactical takedown that most of her security team couldn't replicate with live ammunition practice. But when Torres placed the folder in her hands, her expression shifted again. Her eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. Her jaw tightened. "You need to see this before it disappears," Torres said. He showed her the deletion timestamp. He showed her the recovery data. He showed her that Sterling had accessed the files at 3:56 p.m., approximately 15 minutes before Torres noticed the deletion attempt and backtracked every fragment. The Georgia Medical Board received Torres' evidence package at 4:32 p.m. Sterling's personal attorney called him at 5:15 p.m. with a message that took exactly 3 seconds to deliver: "Don't say anything." Board members Patricia Hargrove and Joel Thompson received subpoenas by end of business that evening. Sterling sat alone in his empty office, his medical license dissolving in real time as the board's emergency session convened without him. The cardiac wing he'd controlled for 7 years, the wing where he'd implemented his fraud, where he'd managed patients and staff like pieces on a chessboard, was being stripped of his name. His access badge was already deactivated. His passwords were already revoked. By midnight, his career was archaeological. 6 weeks later, Katie Rodriguez stood in the office that now bore her name on a nameplate that reflected the hallway light like a promise kept. Director of Emergency Medicine, Oak Creek Memorial. She wore her dress uniform for the hospital's Veteran Appreciation Ceremony, the fabric a sharp navy that seemed to straighten the hallway itself. And there, finally visible on her shoulder where it had belonged all along, was the faded Special Forces Unit patch. The one that had been sewn inside her jacket lining for 3 years. The one that nobody knew how to see until someone finally saw her. Daniel Carver stood in the front row of the assembly, recovered enough that he walked without assistance, his daughter Sarah beside him in her Navy dress whites, Lieutenant Commander Carver, Oak Creek's newest surgical liaison. Jason Torres received a formal commendation for integrity and was promoted to Director of Hospital IT Security. The board issued a public apology to Katie, and her records were restored with full back pay. News outlets in Savannah ran the story: a nurse subdues armed intruder, turns out to be decorated military veteran. The story went national. The Navy released a carefully worded statement confirming Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez's service record, highlighting 3 tours in Iraq, 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and a Navy Cross. The details were sparse. The reputation was absolute. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification classes at Savannah Community College for $16 an hour. His medical license was permanently revoked. His name was scrubbed from the cardiac wing. The only evidence that he'd ever worked at Oak Creek Memorial was a 7-year gap in the hospital's administrative records, a deletion so complete that future employees would have to ask why 2017 through 2024 seemed to jump directly to 2025. Katie visited Mike's grave that evening, the first time in weeks that she'd gone without rain hammering the ground like judgment. She didn't kneel. She didn't cry. She traced his name on the headstone with a single index finger, the way someone might trace the last letter of a promise being kept. "I did it," she whispered. "I kept my promise. I'm still helping people. And this time, I'm doing it as myself." The next morning, a new intake nurse arrived for her first shift, young, maybe 26, with the kind of haunted eyes that suggested she was running from something. Running, or hiding. Katie caught her in the break room making terrible hospital coffee, and something in the way the woman flinched told Katie everything she needed to know. Katie didn't say anything. She just nodded once. A gesture that said, "I see you. You're safe here. You're seen." The woman's hand stopped shaking. So if you're watching this and someone in your life seems to be hiding something, a skill, a secret, a call sign they don't mention at dinner, maybe look twice. Maybe see them the way Daniel Carver saw Katie in that moment. Maybe recognize that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like this video, and comment below. What would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have gone back to that hospital, or would you have walked away forever? Let me know. I read every comment.